In 1982, the year was hot and dry in that corner of Texas where the earth cracked like old pottery, and the wind carried the smell of dust and diesel. Margaret Hale was 53 years old then, a widow with hands that had known more grief than grace, and she stood in her front yard one April morning holding a sapling no taller than her knee, the white oak. She had driven 3 hours to a nursery in Austin to find it, paid $11 for a root ball wrapped in burlap, and carried it home in the bed of her rusted Ford pickup like it was something precious, something that mattered. The neighbors watched from porches and kitchen windows. The Hendersons from across the street, who had lived there since the Eisenhower administration and believed that any tree not producing pecans or peaches was a waste of good soil. The Miller brothers, who ran cattle on the scrubland west of town and thought anything that didn't feed livestock or earn a profit was foolishness. Old Mrs. Delacroix, who sat in her rocking chair every afternoon with a glass of sweet tea and a mouthful of opinions she never kept to herself. Margaret didn't care. She had lost her husband Thomas to a heart attack in the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly in 1979. She had buried him in the little cemetery behind the Baptist church on Route 9, and she had stood there in the Texas heat while the preacher read verses about eternal life and the mourners fanned themselves with funeral programs. She had gone home to a house that felt too big and too quiet, and she had realized something that took her 3 years to put into words. She needed something that would outlast her. That's why she planted the white oak. She dug the hole herself. 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, just like the nursery man had told her. She broke the hardpan clay with a pickaxe until her shoulders burned. Then she mixed the native soil with compost and peat moss and a handful of bone meal she found in Thomas's old shed. She lowered the root ball into the earth like she was laying a baby in a cradle. She packed the soil around it with her bare hands, feeling the grit under her fingernails, the damp coolness of the earth, the promise of something she couldn't yet see. Then she watered it, 5 gallons every morning for the first month, then every other day, then once a week as the summer heat built and the cicadas screamed in the mesquite trees. She mulched it with pine straw she gathered from the woods behind the property. She wrapped the trunk in burlap when the first freeze came in November, and she checked it every morning through the winter, brushing snow off the protective wrapping, talking to it sometimes, telling it to hold on, to be patient, to do what oaks do. The Hendersons laughed first. "Margaret, honey, you know that's a white oak, right?" Jim Henderson called from his driveway one morning in June, leaning against his Buick with a cup of coffee in his hand and a smirk on his face. "Those things grow slower than molasses in January. You'll be dead before it gives you any shade." His wife Carol laughed from the porch, a high tinkling sound that carried across the street like broken glass. "My grandmother had a white oak in Louisiana," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Took 15 years before it looked like anything but a stick in the ground." 15 years, Margaret. You got 15 years? Margaret didn't answer. She was on her knees beside the sapling, pulling weeds from the mulch ring, her knees aching, her back stiff, her hands brown with dirt. She looked at the oak. It had grown maybe 6 inches since she planted it. 6 inches in 2 months. The leaves were small and pale, still finding their strength. She touched one gently, feeling the tiny veins like the map of a river system she had never seen. "You'll see," she whispered to the tree. "Not to the Hendersons. Never to them. You'll see." The Miller brothers were worse. They were cattlemen, hard men with sun-leathered faces and hands like catcher's mitts, and they drove past Margaret's property every Tuesday and Thursday to check their fences. The first year, they didn't say anything. They just looked. The second year, they started honking. The third year, they stopped. "Margaret, that thing's a joke," Dwayne Miller said one afternoon in August, leaning out of his truck window, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who has never needed anything to grow. "My daddy used to say white oaks are for people who don't know what time it is. You know what time it is, Margaret. It's time to plant something that'll feed you or fuel you or earn you something. That tree's just taking up space." His brother Roy laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "She's growing a grave marker, Dwayne. That's all it is. A grave marker that takes 50 years to get big enough to read." Margaret stood up slowly, her knees popping, her hands on her hips. She looked at the Miller brothers with eyes that had seen too much to be intimidated by men who measured worth in quarterly profits and head of cattle. "You know what your problem is, Dwayne," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the still afternoon air. "You think everything has to be useful right now. You think patience is the same thing as weakness. But I've buried a husband and outlived 2 sisters and watched this town turn itself inside out more times than I can count. And I'll tell you something for free. The things that matter most are the things you can't see growing." Dwayne Miller stared at her for a long moment, then spat out the window and drove away, gravel spraying from his tires. Roy shook his head and followed. Margaret watched them go, then turned back to her oak. It was 4 feet tall now. 4 feet in 2 years. She could have walked faster than it grew. But she knew something they didn't. She knew about roots. The thing about white oaks, the thing the nurseryman had told her, and what she had read in every book she could find at the county library, was that they don't show you their work. Not at first. While the top of the tree inches upward, barely perceptible, the roots are doing something else entirely. They are reaching down, deep down, through the hardpan clay, through the limestone shelves, through the layers of earth that have been compressed for millennia. They are building a foundation that no storm can shake, no drought can break, no passing cruelty can destroy. In the first year, the roots of a white oak can extend 20 feet horizontally and 10 feet deep. In the second year, 30 feet. By the 5th year, the root system can be 3 times wider than the tree is tall, a hidden network of strength and sustenance that anchors the tree to the earth more securely than any building or fence or human promise. Margaret knew this. She had read it in a book by a botanist from the University of Texas, a thin volume with a cracked spine and pencil notes in the margins. She had underlined the passage. The white oak invests its first decade in invisibility. What happens above ground is almost incidental to what happens below. That's what she was planting. Not shade, not beauty, not even legacy exactly. She was planting patience. She was planting faith in a future she would not live to see. She was planting the idea that some things are worth doing precisely because they take longer than a human lifetime to complete. The 4th year, the drought came .1986. The worst drought in Texas since the Dust Bowl. The creeks dried up. The stock tanks turned to cracked mud. The mesquite trees dropped their leaves in July, a month early, surrendering to the heat. The Henderson's pecan orchard lost half its trees. The Miller brothers had to sell 60 head of cattle at a loss because there was no grass left to feed them. The town imposed water restrictions, and people stood in line at the grocery store to buy bottled water, talking about the end times and God's judgment and the folly of living in a place that didn't want them. Margaret's white oak suffered. The leaves turned brown at the edges, then curled, then fell. By August, the tree looked dead, bare branches against a sky that never seemed to cloud over. The Hendersons pointed from their porch. The Miller brothers honked louder now, a mocking blast of the horn every time they passed. Even Mrs. Delacroix, who had kept her opinions to herself for 3 years, shook her heads and said, "Poor Margaret, all that work for nothing." But Margaret knew something about drought, too. She knew that oaks didn't die easily. She knew that the deep roots, The ones that had been reaching down through the hardpan for 4 years were finding water tables that the shallow-rooted pecans and mesquites could never touch. She watered the oak with bathwater, with dishwater, with every drop she could save. She carried buckets from the rain barrel she kept covered behind the shed, and she poured them slowly around the base, watching the earth drink like a thirsty man at a desert spring. And in September, when the first cool front came down from the panhandle and the sky finally cracked open with rain, the oak budded, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually over 2 weeks, tiny green points appearing at the tips of branches that had looked dead for months. By October, it had leaves again, small, tentative, but alive. Margaret stood under that tree in the cool of an October morning, her hand on the trunk that was now almost 6 inches in diameter, and she cried, not for the tree, not for herself, for the sheer stubborn persistence of life, for the refusal to die, for the quiet victory of roots over drought, of patience over despair. The Hendersons didn't see it. They were too busy calculating their losses, filing insurance claims, replanting pecan saplings that would take another decade to bear. The Miller brothers didn't see it. They were negotiating loans, cursing the weather, blaming the government. Mrs. Delacroix didn't see it. She had moved to a retirement home in San Antonio, her rocking chair empty. Her opinions carried with her to a place where no one knew Margaret Hale or her oak tree. But Margaret saw, and she kept seeing year after year, as the tree grew and the world around it changed and the laughter continued, softer now, more puzzled, less certain. By 1987, the oak was 8 feet tall, not impressive, not dramatic. A thin trunk, a sparse canopy, the kind of tree you might walk past without noticing. But Margaret noticed. She noticed the way the bark was beginning to furrow, developing the characteristic ridges and valleys of a mature white oak. She noticed the leaves growing larger, darker, more substantial. She noticed the acorns appearing for the first time, small green nubs in the spring that swelled through the summer and turned brown in the fall. The acorns were a revelation. They meant the tree was mature enough to reproduce. It wasn't just surviving anymore. It was planning for a future beyond itself. Margaret gathered a handful of acorns one October afternoon, sitting on the ground beneath the tree, her back against the trunk that was now wide enough to feel solid, and she held them in her palm, like coins from a kingdom she was building 1 inch at a time. She planted some of them in the back field, near the fence line, in the little grove where Thomas had once talked about building a workshop he never got around to constructing. She planted them the same way she had planted the parent tree, with care and compost, and the particular tenderness of someone who understands that the future is not something that happens to you, but something you build with your own 2 hands, one slow decision at a time. The 8th year, 1990, the oak was 12 feet tall. Still not a shade tree, still not impressive. But something had changed in the way the light fell through its branches, something in the quality of the green, something in the sound the leaves made in a breeze that was different from the sound of mesquite or pecan or the hackberry trees that grew wild in the creek bottoms. Birds had started coming. First, a pair of Carolina wrens building a nest in the fork of a low branch. Then a mockingbird singing from the topmost twig at dawn, its repertoire of borrowed songs echoing across the yard. Then a red-bellied woodpecker drumming against the bark in search of insects, leaving tiny holes that would heal over in the seasons to come. Then squirrels, first 1, then 3, then a dozen, chasing each other through the branches, burying acorns in the yard, forgetting where they had hidden them, planting future oaks without knowing it. Margaret watched them all from her kitchen window, her coffee growing cold, her heart full of a feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was more like recognition. The recognition that she had created something that was now creating itself, that the tree had become a world, a small but complete ecosystem, a place where life gathered and multiplied and continued. The Hendersons sold their house in 1991. Jim's health had failed, and Carol couldn't manage the pecan orchard alone, and their children had moved to Dallas and Houston, and places where the economy made more sense than agriculture. They packed their belongings into a moving truck one hot June morning, and Jim stood in the driveway for a long moment, looking across the street at Margaret's oak. It was 15 feet tall now, its canopy spreading maybe 10 feet wide, still not the grand tree Margaret had imagined, but unmistakably a tree now, not a sapling, not a stick, but something with presence and weight. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Then he got in the truck and drove away, and the Hendersons' house sat empty for 2 years before a young couple from Austin bought it and renovated it, and planted a row of Leyland cypress along the property line that would grow fast and die young and never host a single bird's nest. The Miller brothers stopped honking in 1992. Roy died of a heart attack in the cab of his truck, parked in the feed store lot, slumped over the steering wheel with a receipt for mineral blocks still in his hand. Dwayne sold the ranch to a developer from Houston who wanted to build a golf course, and he moved to a condo in Corpus Christi where he could fish from a pier and complain about the seagulls and never think about Margaret Hale or her oak tree or the things he had said that echoed in his own mind on quiet nights. By 1992, the oak was 20 feet tall. Its canopy spread 15 feet in every direction. In the summer, it cast a shadow large enough to cover Margaret's entire front porch, and she sat in that shadow every afternoon with her sweet tea and her library books and the company of birdsong. The temperature under the oak was 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding yard. The grass beneath it stayed green longer into the droughts. The air smelled different there, cleaner, charged with the particular oxygen-rich freshness of a mature hardwood. And still they laughed, or some of them did. New neighbors who didn't know the story, teenagers who drove past too fast, music blaring, throwing beer cans into the ditch. Strangers who saw an old woman sitting under an oak tree and assumed she was waiting for death instead of watching life unfold. But the laughter was different now. It lacked conviction. It had the hollow ring of people who mock what they don't understand, because understanding would require them to admit that they have never planted anything that takes longer than a season to grow. Margaret didn't hear most of it. She was too busy. She had started a garden under the oak's canopy, shade-loving plants that would have withered in the Texas sun, hostas, ferns, coral bells, Solomon's seal. She had built a stone path from the porch to the base of the tree, laying each flagstone herself, leveling it with sand, filling the gaps with moss that she transplanted from the creek. She had hung a wooden swing from the lowest branch, a simple plank suspended by rope, and she sat in it sometimes in the evening, pushing off with her feet, watching the sky turn orange and purple through the lattice of leaves. The 10th year was 1992. The oak was 22 feet tall, its trunk 2 feet in diameter, its canopy spreading 20 feet across. It was no longer possible to ignore. It was no longer possible to mock. The tree had become what Margaret had always known it would become, a presence, a landmark, a living architecture that dominated the yard and the street and the imagination of anyone who looked at it with eyes that could see. And then the storm came, August 1992. Hurricane Andrew had devastated Florida, and the remnants of the storm system had moved west across the Gulf of Mexico, gathering moisture and momentum, colliding with a cold front from the north, creating a supercell that the meteorologists would later call the Texas Tempest of '92. The sky turned green at noon. The air grew still and heavy. pressing against the eardrums like a held breath. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and the wind began. First from the southeast, warm and wet, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. Then from the northwest, cold and sharp, the collision of air masses that spawned tornadoes across 3 counties. Then from everywhere at once, a sustained blow of 70, 80, 90 miles per hour that tore roofs from houses, flipped cars on the interstate, snapped power poles like matchsticks, and turned the world into a chaos of flying debris and screaming wind and the sound of destruction that was louder than any human voice. Margaret huddled in her bathroom, the innermost room of the house, a mattress pulled over her, listening to the world come apart. She heard her porch roof tear away. She heard her fence go down. She heard the crash of something heavy hitting the house, the shatter of glass, the groan of timber under stress. She prayed, not for herself, but for the oak. Not because she was afraid of dying, but because she had spent 10 years building something, and she couldn't bear the thought of it being destroyed in an hour. The storm lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes of hell that felt like 40 years. When the wind finally died and the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the sky began to lighten from black to gray to a strange yellow-green, Margaret emerged from the bathroom into a house that was half destroyed. The roof was gone over the kitchen. Windows were shattered. Her porch was scattered across the yard in splinters. The fence was flattened. The garden she had built under the oak was a mud pit, plants uprooted and washed away, stone path buried under debris, but the oak stood. She walked out into the yard, her shoes squelching in the mud, her hair plastered to her face, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she saw it. The white oak, 22 feet tall, its canopy stripped of some branches, its leaves scattered across the county, but its trunk straight and true and unbroken. The ground around it was torn up, the roots exposed in places where the soil had washed away, but they held, deep in the earth 20 feet down, 30 feet wide. The root system that had been building for 10 years gripped the bedrock like fingers and refused to let go. Margaret walked to the tree and put her arms around it, her cheek against the wet bark, and she wept. She wept for the house and the garden and the 10 years of work that the storm had scattered. But she wept more for the miracle of survival, for the vindication of patience, for the proof that what you build slowly and deeply cannot be destroyed quickly or easily. The rest of the neighborhood was not so lucky. The Hendersons' old house, now owned by the Austin couple, had lost its roof entirely. The leyland cypresses they had planted were uprooted and thrown across the yard like discarded toothpicks. The Miller brothers' old ranch, now the site of a half-built golf course, was a lake of mud, the construction equipment overturned. The saplings they had planted for fairway borders washed into the creek. Across the street, the Johnsons' 100-year-old pecan tree, the one that had produced shade and nuts and family memories for 3 generations, had split down the middle, its shallow roots unable to hold against the wind. The Thompsons' ornamental Bradford pear, planted for its quick growth and showy spring flowers, had shattered into 1,000 pieces, its weak branch structure no match for the storm's fury. Everywhere Margaret looked, trees were down, power lines tangled in branches, houses crushed under trunks that had stood for decades but had never built the foundations to survive. The town would be without electricity for 2 weeks. The cleanup would take months. The insurance adjusters would come and shake their heads and write checks that never quite covered the loss. But the oak stood, and in the days that followed, as Margaret swept glass from her floors and tarped her roof and boiled water for coffee over a camp stove, people began to come. First the neighbors from the next street, who had heard the stories but had never really looked at the tree. Then the volunteers from the church, bringing food and supplies and helping hands. Then strangers, drawn by the rumor of the oak that had survived when everything else had fallen. They stood in its shade those first few days because it was the only shade left. The temperature under the oak was 20 degrees cooler than the surrounding devastation. The air was cleaner, filtered through the leaves that remained. The sound of birds, survivors who had clung to the branches during the storm, filled the space with a music that seemed impossible in the wreckage. And they looked at the tree differently now. Not as a joke, not as a folly, but as something they had never seen before, proof that the slow way, the patient way, the way that invests in what cannot be seen, is the only way that lasts. Margaret didn't say, "I told you so." She had never been that kind of woman. She just sat in her swing, which had somehow survived, and she watched the people gather, and she answered their questions when they asked. "How did you know?" a young woman asked, a volunteer from Austin who had driven down to help with the cleanup. She stood with her hand on the trunk, looking up into the canopy, her eyes wide with something like wonder. "How did you know it would survive?" Margaret thought for a long moment, the swing moving gently beneath her. "I didn't," she said finally, "not for sure. But I knew something about roots. I knew that what happens underground matters more than what happens above. I knew that a tree that takes 10 years to look like anything is building something that a storm can't take away." The young woman nodded, not fully understanding, but storing the words away for a future day when she might need them. By the end of the first week, the oak had become something else. Not just Margaret's tree anymore, the community's tree, the survivor's tree. People brought folding chairs and sat in its shade during the day, sharing food and stories and the particular solidarity that comes from living through something terrible together. At night, they hung lanterns from the lower branches, creating a circle of light in the darkness that had fallen over the town when the power failed. Children climbed the oak for the first time, finding footholds in the bark, discovering the secret world of the canopy, seeing the neighborhood from a perspective they had never imagined. Teenagers carved initials in the trunk, not out of vandalism but out of a need to mark their presence, to say, "I was here, I survived, I matter." Couples sat against the trunk in the evening, holding hands, saying things they had never said before because the storm had reminded them that time is shorter than we think. Margaret watched it all from her swing, and she felt something she had not expected. Not pride, not vindication. Something quieter and deeper, the feeling of a circle completing. The feeling of a seed planted in grief and loneliness growing into a tree that sheltered a community. The feeling of a life that had seemed small and foolish to others becoming, in the end, exactly what it needed to be. The years that followed were not easy. Margaret rebuilt her house, piece by piece, with help from neighbors and volunteers and the insurance money that took 18 months to arrive. She replanted her garden. Not the same shade-loving plants, but new ones, different ones, a garden that reflected the changed light and the changed world. She grew older, her hair turning white, her hands growing more knotted, her steps slower and more deliberate, but the oak kept growing. By 2000, it was 40 feet tall. Its canopy spread 30 feet in every direction, a dome of green that dominated the yard and spilled over the fence line into the street. The trunk was 4 feet in diameter, too large for Margaret to reach around anymore. The bark had developed the deep furrows and ridges of a truly ancient tree, creating habitats for insects and lichens and the tiny mosses that colonized the north-facing side. The ecosystem had exploded. The birds that had come in the 8th year had multiplied into dozens of species. Woodpeckers, warblers, thrushes, owls, hawks. The squirrels had established a dynasty, generations of them living and dying in the branches, burying acorns in yards up and down the street, planting descendants that would outlast their planters. A family of raccoons had taken up residence in a hollow that formed where a branch had been lost in the storm, raising kits every spring that emerged at dusk to raid garbage cans and explore the world. Butterflies came for the flowers that grew in the shade of the canopy. Bees came for the pollen. Bats came for the insects that gathered in the evening air. A fox had been seen once, slipping through the fence at dawn, pausing beneath the oak to listen for mice in the leaf litter. A barred owl called from the highest branch every night, its voice carrying across the sleeping neighborhood like a question asked by the darkness itself. Margaret had become something of a local legend by then. The Oak Lady, they called her, though never to her face. Children from the elementary school came on field trips to see the tree, to hear the story, to touch the bark and imagine what it had been like to plant something so small and wait so long. The local newspaper had written about her twice. Short human interest pieces with black and white photos that didn't capture the green of the leaves or the size of the trunk or the feeling of standing beneath the canopy and looking up. She answered their questions patiently, always the same answers, always the same lesson. It's about roots, she would say. It's about what you can't see. It's about believing in a future you won't live to see. By 2010, Margaret was 81 years old. She had outlived most of her contemporaries. The people who had laughed at her were gone. Jim Henderson dead in Dallas, Carol in a nursing home she hated. Dwayne Miller fished out of the Gulf after a boating accident. Mrs. Delacroix's rocking chair long empty. The new neighbors didn't know the story. They had moved to Texas from California and New York and Michigan, drawn by the economy and the space and the promise of a new start. They saw the oak and assumed it had always been there, a natural feature of the landscape, something that existed before memory and would exist after. Margaret didn't mind. She had never planted the tree for recognition. She had planted it for something deeper, something that didn't require witnesses to be real. But she was tired. The years had accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, pressing down on her bones and her breath and her will to continue. She had fallen twice, once in the kitchen and once in the garden, and, though she had recovered both times, the falls had taken something from her that she couldn't name. She slept more. She ate less. She spent longer hours in the swing, watching the light move through the leaves, listening to the birds, feeling the breeze that seemed to come from somewhere far away and long ago. In the spring of 2012, she made a decision. She called her nephew, Thomas's sister's son, a man named David, who lived in Austin and worked in computers, and visited twice a year with his wife and their 2 children. She told him she wanted to sell the house. She told him she wanted to move to a facility where people could help her, where she wouldn't fall alone, where the daily tasks of living wouldn't require more strength than she had left. David came the next weekend, worried, ready to argue, ready to tell her she was being hasty, that she had plenty of years left, that the house was her home and she shouldn't leave it. But when he saw her, when he really looked at her, he understood. She was smaller than he remembered. The bones of her face showed through skin that had grown thin and translucent. Her hands shook when she lifted her coffee cup. She walked with a cane that had been Thomas's, the wood worn smooth by decades of use, and she was peaceful. More peaceful than he had ever seen her. The anxiety that had always lurked beneath her surface, the need to prove herself, to justify her choices, to defend her tree against mockery, it was gone. She had nothing left to prove. The tree had proven it for her. "I want to stay until the fall," she said. "I want to see one more autumn. I want to see the leaves turn." David agreed. He helped her find a facility in Austin, a place with gardens and good light and staff who seemed kind. He arranged for the sale of the house, not to a developer but to a young family who had seen the oak and fallen in love with it, who promised to care for it, who understood that they were buying more than a house. And Margaret stayed. Through the summer, through the heat, through the long August days when the cicadas screamed and the air shimmered and the oak cast its shade over the yard like a benediction. She sat in her swing every afternoon, and she watched the tree, and she talked to it sometimes, not expecting an answer but knowing that the tree heard her in its own way, through the roots that still connected them, through the air they shared, through the slow accumulation of years that had made them both part of the same story. The leaves turned in October, not all at once, but gradually over 2 weeks, the green fading to yellow, then gold, then a brown so rich it looked like copper in the afternoon light. They fell slowly, drifting down like coins from a treasure chest, carpeting the ground in a layer so thick it muffled footsteps. Margaret walked through them every morning, her cane sinking into the soft carpet, her breath visible in the cool air, her heart full of a sadness that was also a joy. She left in November. David drove her to Austin in his car, the oak visible in the rear-view mirror until they turned the corner and it was gone. She didn't look back. She had said her goodbyes. She had touched the bark one last time, pressed her cheek against it, whispered words that no one else heard. She had planted an acorn in the yard, one of the tree's own children, in the spot where she had first dug the hole 30 years before. The facility was fine, better than fine. She had a room with a window that looked out on a garden, not an oak but a maple, which turned red in the fall and dropped its leaves in a single dramatic gesture rather than the slow, patient descent of the white oak. She made friends. She played cards. She told the story of the oak to anyone who would listen, and some of them listened well, and one of them, a woman named Eleanor, who had lost her husband to Alzheimer's and her daughter to cancer, took the story into her heart and began planting things of her own. Margaret died in March of 2015, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86. David was with her, holding her hand, feeling the moment when the pulse stopped and the breath ceased, and the person who had been Margaret Hale became something else, something that couldn't be named but could be felt, like the space between notes in a song, like the silence after a storm. The funeral was small. The family she had left, the friends from the facility, a few neighbors from the old house who remembered her. They buried her in the cemetery behind the Baptist church on Route 9, in the plot next to Thomas, where she had always known she would end up. The gravestone was simple. Margaret Hale, 1929 to 2015. She planted trees. But the real memorial was elsewhere, 33 miles away in the yard of the house she had sold, beneath the canopy of the white oak she had planted in 1982. A gathering happened that no one had planned. The young family who had bought the house, the neighbors who had heard the stories, the children who had climbed the branches, the teenagers who had carved their initials, the couples who had sat against the trunk in the evening. They came, not because they had been invited, but because they had to, because the tree was there and it meant something, and they needed to be near it. They stood in the shade of the oak on a warm March afternoon, the sky blue and clear, the air smelling of earth and new growth. They looked up at the canopy that spread 50 feet across, at the trunk that was 5 feet in diameter, at the branches that had grown so thick and strong they could support the weight of a grown man. They listened to the birds, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, a chorus of life that filled the air with sound. They watched a squirrel race up the bark, pause at a branch, look down at them with bright black eyes, and continue on its urgent business, and they told stories. The young father who had bought the house told how his daughter had learned to climb on the lowest branch, how she had fallen once and cried, then climbed again, then again, until she could reach the top and see the whole neighborhood spread out beneath her like a map. The neighbor from next door told how the oak had saved her house during the flood of 1998, its roots absorbing water that would have swamped her foundation, its canopy breaking the force of the rain. The old man from down the street told how he proposed to his wife under the oak in 1995, how she had said yes, how they had returned every year on the anniversary to sit in the swing and remember. A woman named Eleanor, who had driven from Austin with a car full of potted saplings, stood at the edge of the gathering and listened. She had never met Margaret, but she knew her story, and she had planted 3 trees in her own yard because of it. And she had watched them grow, and she had felt something change in her own heart. Something that had been hard and closed, beginning to open like a bud in spring. She stepped forward when the stories ended, and she placed one of her saplings at the base of the oak. A white oak, grown from an acorn she had gathered from the tree itself, propagated in a nursery, ready to be planted. She didn't say anything. She just put it there, and she stepped back, and she let the silence speak. The gathering broke up slowly, people drifting away in 2s and 3s, back to their houses and their lives and their own small gardens. But the tree remained. The oak remained. It had been there for 33 years, and it would be there for 300 more. Long after everyone who had known Margaret was gone, long after the houses had been rebuilt and rebuilt again, long after the town had changed its name and its character and its reason for being. It would be there when the climate shifted and the species changed and the world became something no one could predict. It would be there when the acorns it dropped grew into new oaks that spread across the county, a forest where there had once been prairie, a woodland where there had once been scrub. It would be there when the last human who remembered Margaret Hale's name was forgotten, and the only evidence of her existence was the tree itself, and the stories embedded in its rings, and the genetic code in its cells that carried forward the particular resilience of a tree that had survived drought and storm and mockery and time, and the people who had laughed. The Hendersons and the Millers and the others who had mocked her patience, who had called her foolish, who had measured worth in quarterly returns and immediate gratification. They were gone. Their houses had changed hands. Their pecan orchards had been subdivided. Their cattle ranches had become suburbs. Their laughter had faded into the wind, into silence, into the kind of forgetting that erases everything that doesn't matter. But the people who sat under the oak now, the children who climbed its branches, the birds who nested in its canopy, the squirrels who buried its acorns, the insects who lived in its bark, they didn't know about the laughter. They didn't know about the mockery. They only knew the shade and the shelter and the abundance and the quiet persistence of something that had been built slowly and deeply and well. And they told the story. Not the same story, but a version of it. A story about an old woman who planted something that took longer than a lifetime to grow. A story about patience and faith and the invisible work of roots. A story about the difference between what looks impressive and what actually lasts. They told it to their children. Who told it to theirs? Who told it to theirs? The way stories always travel, changing a little with each telling, gaining details and losing others, becoming legend and then myth and then something that was just true without needing to be verified. And the oak grew. It grew through the decades and the centuries. It grew through droughts and floods and storms that made the tempest of '92 look like a spring shower. It grew through the changes that came to the land and the people and the world, always reaching up, always reaching down, always building what could not be seen. By the time the tree was 200 years old, it was the largest white oak in Texas. Its canopy spread 100 feet across. Its trunk was 12 feet in diameter. Its roots extended 200 feet in every direction, deep into the aquifer, wide into the surrounding soil, a hidden network of strength that supported not just the tree but the entire ecosystem that had grown around it. Scientists came to study it. Poets came to write about it. Pilgrims came to sit beneath it and feel something they couldn't name, a connection to time and patience and the slow work of becoming. Children came to climb it, to fall from it, to learn that pain was temporary and courage was a choice. Lovers came to propose under it, to marry under it, to grow old under it, to be buried inside of it. And always, in every telling, in every visit, in every moment of wonder beneath its branches, there was the story of Margaret. Not her whole life, not the details of her grief and her loneliness and her stubborn refusal to give up. Just the essential truth. She planted something she would not live to see completed. She invested in a future she would not inhabit. She built roots that would outlast her branches. The oak became a monument to that idea, a living cathedral where people came to worship not a god but a possibility, the possibility that the best things we do are the things we do for people we will never meet, in a time we will never see, for a world that will exist only because we had the patience to plant it. And in the end, that was the answer to the laughter. Not vindication, not revenge, not even the quiet satisfaction of being right. The answer was the tree itself. The answer was the shade. The answer was the shelter. The answer was the life that gathered and multiplied and continued because one woman, on one hot April day in 1982, had dug a hole in hardpan clay and placed a sapling in the earth and believed against all evidence, against all mockery, against all the voices that said it was foolish, that it would grow. It grew. It grew beyond her. It grew beyond them all. It grew into something that no one could have predicted and no one could have planned. Something that existed not because it was useful or profitable or immediately gratifying, but because it was good, because it was beautiful, because it was the right thing to do in a world that too often chose the fast and the easy and the disposable, and the people who sat under it, generation after generation, century after century. They understood something that Margaret had known without being able to articulate it. They understood that the world is not made by the people who laugh. It is made by the people who plant. It is sustained by the people who wait. It is saved by the people who build what cannot be seen, what cannot be measured, what cannot be destroyed by storm or time, or the cruelty of those who don't understand. The oak stood. The oak stands. The oak will stand long after this story is told, long after these words are forgotten, long after the last human voice has faded into the silence that waits at the end of all things, and in its standing it speaks, not in words, but in presence, not in argument, but in example. It speaks of Margaret Hale, who planted it. It speaks of every person who has ever chosen the slow path, the patient path, the path that builds roots instead of branches, foundations instead of facades, futures instead of presents. It speaks to you, now, wherever you are, whatever you are planting, whatever laughter you are enduring, whatever storm you are waiting to survive. It speaks the only truth that matters. Keep going. Keep growing. Keep building what cannot be seen. The world will mock you, and the world will forget you. And the world will move on to faster and louder and more immediately impressive things. But the tree will remember. The tree will stand. The tree will outlast every voice that ever laughed, every hand that ever pointed, every eye that ever looked at what you are building and called it foolish. Because the tree knows what the laughter never learned, that what happens underground is always more important than what happens above. That the work you do in darkness, in silence, in solitude, in the face of mockery and doubt and the crushing weight of impatience, That work is the only work that lasts, Margaret knew. She knew in 1982, kneeling in hardpan clay, her hands bleeding, her back aching, her heart broken. She knew when the Hendersons laughed and the Millers honked, and the years passed with agonizing slowness, and the tree seemed to grow not at all. She knew when the drought came and the storm came and the world fell apart around her, and the only thing that remained was the oak, standing, rooted, patient, true. She knew, and she planted, and she waited, and she trusted, and the tree grew, not for her, not for them, for the future, for the shade that would fall on faces she would never see, for the branches that would hold children she would never meet, for the roots that would anchor a world she would never know. That is the story of the white oak. That is the story of Margaret Hale. That is the story of every person who has ever planted something in faith and watched it grow beyond their wildest imagining, beyond their own brief lifetime, beyond the reach of memory itself. It is a story about roots. It is a story about patience. It is a story about the quiet, stubborn, unkillable persistence of life when it is planted deep and tended well. And it is a story about you, about whatever you are planting now. In the face of laughter, in the face of doubt, in the face of a world that wants everything fast and easy and immediately visible, about the roots you are building, the foundation you are laying, the future you are creating with every slow, patient, invisible choice. The oak took 30 years to become magnificent. It took 100 to become legendary. It took 200 to become eternal. But it started with one woman, one hole, one sapling, one act of faith in a future she would not live to see. Plant your oak, dig your hole, break your hardpan, mix your compost, lower your root ball, pack your soil, water your dream, and wait. Wait through the laughter, wait through the drought, wait through the storm. Wait through the years when nothing seems to grow and the world seems to mock your every effort. Because beneath the surface, where no one can see, where no one measures, where no one applauds, that is where the real work happens. That is where the roots go deep. That is where the foundation is built that will hold when everything else falls. And one day, long after the laughter has faded, and the mockers have gone, and the world has changed in ways you cannot imagine, someone will stand beneath the branches of what you planted. They will look up in wonder. They will feel the shade on their face. They will hear the birds singing in the canopy. And they will know without being told that someone planted this. Someone believed. Someone waited. Someone built what could not be seen. That someone is you. That is the story of the white oak. That is the story of Margaret Hale. That is the story of every dream that outlasts the dreamer. Every hope that outlasts the hoping. Every love that outlasts the lover. Plant it. Water it. Wait for it. The tree will grow. The shade will come. The story will continue. And the laughter will be forgotten long before the oak is done growing.